Intro. When our overbearing HOA president, Karen, decided she had the right to use our home's Wi-Fi for her official community work, I didn't think much of it until she started acting like she owned it. But when my tech-savvy teenage son decided to change the password, her meltdown was immediate and dramatic. What she didn't expect was that the simple change would uncover a shocking secret that left the entire neighborhood stunned. Karen had always been a presence in the neighborhood that you couldn't quite ignore. She was the kind of HOA president who believed that the title gave her authority over every small detail of the community, right down to how tall your grass should be and what kind of flowers you planted in your front yard. At first, it was almost amusing to watch her march from one house to another with her clipboard, barking recommendations, as though she were running a military base rather than a suburban neighborhood. But over time, her involvement began to creep into areas that were unquestionably personal. That's how the whole Wi-Fi situation started. It began innocently enough, or at least it appeared to. Karen came to the door one afternoon with her usual overly bright smile, speaking in that overly sweet tone she used whenever she wanted something. She explained that as HOA president, she often had to send out urgent updates to the residents, access community spreadsheets, and even host video meetings for the board. But apparently, her home internet wasn't reliable, and she had dead zones that made her work nearly impossible. She proposed, no, more like insisted, that it would be a great idea for us to share our Wi-Fi with her so she could better serve the community. She assured us it would only be temporary until her provider sorted things out, which she claimed would take just a week or two. At first, I didn't see the harm. I knew she could be difficult if she didn't get her way, and sharing a password didn't seem like a big deal. Plus, she played it off as a matter of community cooperation. She even hinted that other neighbors had helped her out this way before, framing it like we'd be joining a tradition of neighborhood goodwill. I figured it would save me from the headache of her constant pestering, so I agreed. We gave her the password, and she promised to be respectful of our connection and only use it for official HOA business. For the first few days, nothing seemed out of place. But then I began to notice how often she was parked in her SUV just outside our house, laptop open, typing away. Sometimes she was there early in the morning, other times late at night. When I'd wave, she'd smile and wave back, as if nothing about her sitting in her car on our street for hours was unusual. Soon after, small frustrations began to creep in. Our internet speed started dropping at random times, and streaming movies in the evening became an exercise in patience. My son would complain about his online games lagging or disconnecting entirely. When I mentioned it to Karen casually one day, she brushed it off, claiming she barely used the internet and suggested that maybe our provider was just having issues. She said it with that same saccharine smile, the one that always made it hard to tell if she was being genuine or deflecting. Then there were the little hints that she was using our network for more than she admitted. She would bring up random topics in conversation, like knowing about certain neighborhood gossip before anyone else, or mentioning she had looked into a resident's public records for HOA purposes. I didn't connect the dots immediately, but looking back, it was unsettling. She seemed to be online constantly, and not just in a way that matched her claimed duties as HOA president. She even bragged once about being able to stream high-definition movies without buffering, which struck me as odd since she had complained about her home connection being unreliable. The final straw for my son came one Saturday morning when he was trying to join an important online gaming tournament. He was mid-match when the connection stuttered and dropped completely. Frustrated, he checked the router logs, something I didn't even know he could do, and saw that during the exact time his game lagged, there had been multiple large downloads coming from an unfamiliar device connected to our network. The device name didn't match anything we owned, but the timing was suspiciously in sync with when Karen had been sitting outside in her SUV. He told me that she wasn't just casually checking emails or hosting meetings. She was using our Wi-Fi for heavy data activity, possibly even for things that had nothing to do with the HOA. That was the moment I realized that what I had brushed off as harmless community help might be much deeper and far more intrusive than I had ever anticipated. My son had always been good with technology, better than me if I'm being honest. He could troubleshoot any device, set up networks in minutes, and was always tinkering with gadgets just to see how they worked. So when he started complaining more frequently about our internet speed dropping and strange devices appearing in the router's connected list, I knew he was already thinking of a solution. He's not the kind of kid who complains without a plan. One evening, after another frustrating round of lag during his online game, he sat me down and explained his idea. He wanted to change the Wi-Fi password completely, lock it down with a stronger encryption setting, and limit device access to only the ones we owned. His reasoning was simple. If Karen really needed our internet for official HOA business like she claimed, she could just ask us again for the new password. But if she was using it for things she didn't want to admit, the sudden change would force her hand. I hesitated at first, worried that changing the password without telling her might cause unnecessary drama. I had dealt with Karen enough to know that she didn't handle being denied anything very gracefully. But my son pointed out that it was our internet, we paid for it, and we had every right to decide who used it. He even showed me how many connected devices there were on our network. Far more than just our family's phones, computers, and smart devices. Some of them were completely unrecognizable. One even had a strange alphanumeric name that, according to my son, matched the default naming convention for certain high-end laptops. That was enough for me to realize that something wasn't right. The next day, he took action. He logged into the router's admin panel, changed the network name to something completely different so Karen wouldn't even recognize it, and generated a long, random password full of letters, numbers, and symbols. He also enabled a security feature that blocked any new devices from connecting unless we manually approved them. I watched as he methodically removed every device from the list except for ours, effectively wiping the slate clean. He was so quick and confident about it that I couldn't help but feel a little proud, even though I knew this was going to trigger some sort of reaction from her. Sure enough, the very next morning, things started happening. Karen's SUV pulled up outside like usual, but this time she didn't stay parked for long. She got out, phone in hand, frowning down at the screen as she tapped furiously. She walked up to our door and knocked, a little harder than normal. When I opened it, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She went straight to complaining about how her internet wasn't working and how she had urgent HOA matters that needed attention. I played dumb, saying I hadn't noticed anything unusual with our connection. She asked if I had changed the password, and before I could answer, my son appeared behind me and calmly said, "Yeah, I did. We were having some issues, so I reset everything." The look on her face was priceless, somewhere between disbelief and outrage. She launched into a mini-speech about community spirit, cooperation, and how her work as HOA president benefited all of us. She even tried to guilt-trip us by claiming that without internet access, she couldn't handle important board tasks, which would affect the whole neighborhood. My son didn't flinch. He told her that if she needed the new password for legitimate HOA work, she could send an official request in writing and explain exactly why she needed it. That's when I noticed something shift in her demeanor. It was subtle, but it was there. Her confidence faltered, her words became less smooth, and she seemed almost cornered. She mumbled something about needing to get back to her urgent emails, and left without pressing further. It was in that moment I realized my son had done more than just change a password. He had taken back control of our own property, drawn a clear line in the sand, and put Karen in a position where she couldn't just bully her way into getting what she wanted. It wasn't just about internet access anymore. It was about boundaries, and for the first time in a long while, she couldn't cross ours without permission. Karen's reaction to losing access to our Wi-Fi was nothing short of theatrical. It started with that morning knock at our door, but what followed over the next couple of hours turned into a spectacle for the entire street. After my son told her that he had changed the password and she would need to make an official request to get it again, she didn't leave quietly. She stormed back to her SUV, slammed the door so hard it rattled, and sat there for a while, no doubt furiously typing on her phone. I figured she was either messaging the HOA board or venting to whoever in her circle would listen. Not long after, she was back at our doorstep, this time holding her laptop like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom case. She started explaining, in a tone loud enough for anyone passing by to hear, that she was in the middle of important HOA business when her internet dropped. She accused us of being inconsiderate and irresponsible, claiming we had jeopardized community operations by locking her out. My son stood beside me, arms crossed, looking completely unfazed. I tried to remain calm, but she kept escalating, saying things like, "Do you have any idea how much I do for this neighborhood? And you're making it impossible for me to do my job." Her voice got louder and louder until neighbors began poking their heads out of doors and windows to see what was going on. The more people looked, the more dramatic she became. She started gesturing wildly with her free hand, as if she were giving a speech at a rally. At one point, she even pointed toward our house and said something about us undermining the HOA's authority. It was absurd, especially since we were talking about something as simple as a private internet connection. My son, never one to back down from a challenge, finally asked her point-blank if she could explain exactly what urgent HOA business she had been conducting on our network at 11 o'clock at night. That question seemed to catch her off guard. She stammered for a moment before claiming she was researching zoning regulations. That answer didn't sit right with anyone who heard it, considering zoning regulation sites aren't exactly known for requiring high bandwidth or late-night access. The longer she went on, the more it felt like she was trying to turn this into a public shaming session, hoping that peer pressure from the neighbors would make us hand over the password. She told anyone who would listen that we were hoarding resources and not supporting the community, painting herself as the victim of an unreasonable act. But the truth was, her performance was starting to work against her. People were exchanging skeptical looks, and I even overheard one neighbor mutter, "Why is she using their internet anyway?" Her theatrics reached a peak when she pulled out her phone and started pacing on the sidewalk, loudly declaring that she was reporting this incident to the board. She made sure to mention our names and our house number, as though she was filing an official complaint right there on the spot. I could feel my frustration building, but my son put a hand on my arm and whispered that letting her dig her own hole was the smarter move. Sure enough, her over-the-top behavior began to make her look less like a responsible HOA president and more like someone throwing a tantrum. She tried one last time to guilt us, saying the neighborhood would suffer without her constant oversight. But by then, the audience she had gathered was clearly losing interest. A few people quietly went back inside, shaking their heads. Finally, after nearly an hour of going in circles, Karen huffed, muttered something about handling this another way, and stormed back to her SUV. She drove off in a rush, leaving behind an air of tension and unanswered questions. My son just smiled and said he was pretty sure we hadn't seen the last of her. But now she knew she couldn't just demand whatever she wanted without a fight. Karen's tantrum at our doorstep was only the beginning. By the next day, she had shifted from public theatrics to more official-sounding threats, clearly hoping to intimidate us into compliance. It started with a printed letter slipped into our mailbox, on HOA letterhead, no less, claiming that by withholding necessary resources, we were in violation of the community's cooperation guidelines. I almost laughed when I read it, because nowhere in the HOA bylaws did it say residents had to share their private internet connection. The tone of the letter was both condescending and dramatic, filled with phrases like failure to comply and subject to board review. She even underlined certain words, as if that would somehow make her demands sound more legitimate. My son read it over my shoulder and immediately spotted the holes in her argument. He pointed out that she hadn't cited a single actual rule, regulation, or policy number, just vague references to cooperation and community spirit. It was obvious to him that she was bluffing, hoping we wouldn't know any better. He suggested that instead of ignoring it, we should respond with our own letter, politely but firmly asking her to point out the exact bylaw that gave her the right to demand our Wi-Fi password. That way, she'd either have to admit there wasn't one or dig herself into an even bigger hole trying to make one up. Before we could even draft that letter, she showed up again in person. This time, she had 2 other HOA board members with her, both looking uncomfortable and clearly dragged into this against their will. She introduced them like she was bringing in reinforcements, saying they were there to mediate the situation. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Dave, tried to explain that Karen had told them we were refusing to cooperate and that the matter was causing delays in important board projects. I asked him directly if he was aware that Karen had been using our Wi-Fi for weeks without issue, and if he could explain why it was so critical she had access to it now. Dave looked over at Karen, hesitated, and then admitted he didn't know the full details. Karen immediately jumped in, talking over him and repeating the same lines about urgent community needs. But my son wasn't about to let her steamroll the conversation. He calmly opened his laptop, connected it to our router's admin page, and showed them the logs of unusual activity coming from an unfamiliar device, the same one he'd seen before. He explained that this device had been downloading massive amounts of data late at night, well beyond what would be required for HOA work. The room went quiet except for Karen's huffy sighs. She tried to dismiss it by saying she sometimes streamed training videos for board development, but the excuse sounded weak. The other board member, a woman named Marcy, seemed more interested in what my son had uncovered than in Karen's excuses. She asked if we could send the logs to her for review, which only made Karen more defensive. She started accusing us of spying on her internet use, which was absurd since it was our network to begin with. When my son pointed that out, Karen's voice shot up a notch, and she began pacing on our porch like she owned the place. Her threats became more pointed. She said she would take this to the next level and involve legal counsel if necessary. She claimed the HOA had more power than we realized and could impose fines for non-cooperation. I could tell she was trying to sound intimidating, but the fact that she hadn't produced a single actual rule to back her claims made it obvious she was bluffing. Dave and Marcy exchanged glances, and it was clear they were beginning to question why they were even there. Finally, my son told her, again, that if she needed access for legitimate reasons, all she had to do was submit a written request explaining exactly what she intended to do and why. He added that we would be happy to forward the request to the entire board for transparency. Karen didn't like that one bit. She mumbled something about us making things harder than they need to be, then abruptly announced that she had another meeting to get to. As they walked away, I heard Marcy quietly ask Dave if the HOA had ever provided Wi-Fi to board members before. His answer was a simple no that told me everything I needed to know about how weak Karen's case really was and how much of this was just her trying to exert control. My son wasn't ready to let things end with just changing the password and standing our ground. The unusual device logs had stuck in his mind, and he wanted to know exactly what Karen, or whoever was connected through our network, had been doing all those nights. He wasn't snooping into personal files or anything invasive, but he knew how to analyze network traffic patterns and identify the types of activities happening. Over the next couple of days, he set up monitoring tools on our router to track any connection attempts from devices that had been previously kicked off. Almost immediately, he noticed that the same unfamiliar device had been trying to reconnect multiple times a day, as if someone was repeatedly testing passwords to regain access. It wasn't just a casual check. It was persistent, deliberate, and a little unsettling. He explained that these connection attempts were coming from the same MAC address as before, meaning it was the same physical device. He also pointed out that some of the connection spikes coincided with strange lulls in our neighborhood, times when Karen's SUV happened to be parked on the street with her laptop open. That alone was suspicious, but what really caught his attention was the type of data the device had been transferring when it had been connected. The logs showed patterns consistent with large file downloads and uploads, not just casual browsing or sending emails. He told me this could indicate anything from streaming massive amounts of video to moving large sets of files between servers. Curious, he dug deeper, and what he found made both of us uneasy. The timestamps for the largest data transfers were almost always between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., hours when normal HOA work would be practically non-existent. Even stranger, the activity wasn't consistent with a single big download. It was bursts of heavy traffic, then nothing, then heavy traffic again, almost like someone was accessing multiple different sources or moving files in chunks. My son explained that while it was impossible to see the exact contents of the data, the behavior suggested that the device might have been accessing remote servers or using some kind of file-sharing network. The more he pieced together, the more it seemed that Karen's urgent HOA business excuse was nothing more than a smokescreen. He speculated that she could be using our network to mask her own online activity, essentially hiding behind our IP address so that any questionable activity wouldn't be traced back to her. If that were true, it meant we could have been held responsible for whatever she was doing, which was a scary thought. He also pointed out that if she had been doing something illegal, the consequences could have landed on our doorstep first. I started to realize just how risky it had been to give her our password in the first place. We had assumed she was just freeloading for convenience, but now it seemed possible that there was a deeper reason she had been so insistent. The fact that she reacted so dramatically to losing access suddenly made a lot more sense. She wasn't just losing a free internet connection, she was losing whatever cover our network had been providing her. Rather than confront her immediately, my son decided to document everything. He took screenshots of the router logs, saved the timestamps, and even recorded short screen captures of the connection attempts. He told me that if this ever escalated, whether with the HOA or with law enforcement, we would have clear proof that the suspicious activity wasn't coming from us. I could see how serious he was about it, and frankly, his calm, methodical approach made me feel a lot more secure. At one point, while going over the logs again, he noticed that the connection attempts had slowed down for a day or two after Karen's board visit, only to pick up again late at night. It was almost like someone had taken a break to regroup and then started trying again. This persistence was more than just curiosity, it was determination. And it made my son even more convinced that we had stumbled into something Karen really didn't want us to know about. The whole thing shifted my perspective. What had started as a petty neighborhood dispute over Wi-Fi now looked like it could have serious implications. My son was right, we hadn't just cut off a convenience for Karen, we might have disrupted something much bigger she was involved in, and whatever it was, she wasn't ready to let it go. The truth came out in a way I never could have predicted. It started with a knock at our door. Not from Karen this time, but from Marcy, the other board member who had been with her during the so-called mediation. She looked uneasy, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. She told me she wasn't here on official HOA business, but rather because something about the whole Wi-Fi situation had been bothering her. After my son had shown the board those unusual router logs, she had quietly started asking questions. She spoke with other board members, a couple of neighbors, and even checked some public records. What she found didn't match anything Karen had been telling people. According to Marcy, Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for a number of digital services that no one else on the board had ever approved. They were listed vaguely, things like remote access tools and secure file storage, but the amounts were unusually high for such services. Even more suspicious, the invoices for these expenses were all sent to an email address that wasn't the official HOA one, but a personal address registered to Karen. Marcy suspected that Karen might have been running her own side projects or even a small business under the radar using HOA resources and, in this case, our internet connection to do it. Hearing this made the puzzle pieces click into place. The large data transfers my son had seen, the late-night activity, the desperate attempts to regain access. All of it started to make sense. If Karen had been using our network to conduct business or move files she didn't want linked to her own account, losing access wouldn't just have been inconvenient. It could have exposed everything she'd been doing. Marcy admitted she didn't have proof of what those files were, but the circumstantial evidence was mounting. Things escalated when Marcy revealed that she had confronted Karen about the invoices during a closed board meeting. Karen had brushed her off, claiming she was handling sensitive HOA projects and that she had full authority to manage them without the board's oversight. That explanation didn't sit well with anyone, especially since the HOA's bylaws clearly required approval for any expense over a certain amount. When Marcy pressed for details, Karen shut the meeting down early and left, saying she had more important things to do. The very next day, according to Marcy, Karen sent an urgent email to a select few residents, people she seemed to trust, claiming that certain individuals were trying to sabotage her work for the community. In that email, she implied that I was part of some group that didn't want her to succeed as HOA president. It was a clumsy attempt to shift the blame, but it showed how desperate she was becoming. Meanwhile, my son continued monitoring the network. Even though the password had been changed and our security tightened, there were still sporadic attempts to connect from the same device. Sometimes they happened in the middle of the night, other times in the early morning, almost as if someone was testing whether we'd given in and loosened restrictions. My son started keeping a log not just of the connection attempts, but also of the times Karen's SUV was spotted in the area. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Marcy told me that the rest of the board was now quietly investigating Karen's actions, but they were trying to keep it under wraps until they had enough evidence to act. She warned me to be careful, as Karen had a reputation for retaliating against people who challenged her. In her time on the board, Marcy had seen Karen spread rumors, file petty complaints, and even try to rally certain residents against others just to win a dispute. The most shocking part came when Marcy mentioned that some of the digital services Karen had paid for match tools often used for remote data storage and file encryption. These weren't the kind of tools you'd expect for basic HOA work. They were the kind of things someone might use to hide or secure files from prying eyes. Combined with the fact that she had been using our network without any oversight, it painted a picture that was hard to ignore. By the time Marcy left that afternoon, I knew things were no longer just about an annoying neighbor or a shared Wi-Fi connection. We had stumbled into something bigger, something that involved money, secrecy, and possibly illegal activity. My son, ever the strategist, told me this was exactly why you never let someone like Karen get too comfortable with having access to your resources. We weren't just protecting our internet anymore. We were protecting ourselves from being dragged into whatever mess she had been running in the shadows. Teen.